I woke up earlier than usual that day, as if someone was knocking quietly, but insistently inside. Not an alarm clock, no, it's been there for a while, just for show. I woke up with the feeling that something was going to happen today. Not necessarily something bad, just something. There was that strange tension in the air, familiar from my youth, when you expect congratulations, footsteps, voices, but the house is silent. I lay there and stared at the ceiling. The morning light hadn't yet reached the room. It stood somewhere behind the curtains, like a person hesitant to enter. I thought, today is a holiday. My holiday. It sounds funny when you say that about yourself at that age, but the words still remained. A holiday. A day that once had weight, a smell, a sound. I sat up slowly, waiting for my body to agree. My knees immediately reminded me of themselves, as if saying, "Don't forget how old you are." I nodded to them mentally, and I hadn't forgotten. I got up, threw on a robe, and went into the kitchen. The floor was cold, but it was an honest morning cold. Everything in the kitchen was in its place. A cup, a teapot, an old, cracked sugar bowl. I made some tea and sat at the table. Usually on days like this, the phone rang early, sometimes too early. The children were rushing, afraid to forget. The grandchildren shouted into the phone, interrupting each other. I smiled, pretending to be surprised, although I always expected it. This time, the phone was silent. I told myself, it's still early. They're working, rushing, they'll definitely remember later. I looked at my watch. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. I sipped my tea, trying to stretch out the time as if it could adapt to my anticipation. I thought back to years past. How I'd set the table, how I'd get out the best tablecloth, how I'd check the oven every 5 minutes. As I told myself, don't expect much, just be glad they're there. I've always been good at scaling back my desires so they fit into other people's busy schedules. The phone was still silent. I stood up and paced the room. I stopped at a photograph on the wall. My younger self, with a cake and burning candles. My husband was still alive then. He stood behind me, his hands on my shoulders. I remembered the warmth of those hands. It stayed with me longer than he did. "It's okay," I said out loud. My voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "It's okay." I started cleaning. Not because I had to, but because it was easier not to wait. I dusted and put away the books that no one had touched. Sometimes I caught myself listening for the phone to ring. Every rustle seemed like a promise. By noon, I already knew something was wrong. It's impossible for everyone to forget at once. Even the busiest. Even the most absent-minded. A familiar feeling appeared in my chest. Not pain, no. More like a chill. As if someone had opened a window and forgotten to close it. I sat by the window. Life went on as usual in the courtyard. People were hurrying, laughing, arguing. For them, it was just another day. For me, too, it seemed. I felt resentment rising inside, but it was weak, tired. You have to learn how to be offended, and I'd long ago forgotten how. In the afternoon, I finally picked up my phone and checked my messages. Silence. Not a word. I wanted to text myself, just to remind them, but my fingers wouldn't obey. I suddenly thought, what if they didn't forget? What if they just didn't want to? The thought was too sharp. I pushed it away like a sharp object. I made myself a simple lunch. I ate slowly, without appetite. The holiday dissolved in ordinary movements. I even chuckled. That's it. So easy. It was getting dark towards evening. I turned on the lamp. The light was soft, yellow, but it didn't warm me. I sat down at the table again and suddenly felt tired, not physically, but deeply. The tiredness of waiting. And just then the phone rang. I didn't pick it up right away. I looked at the screen. My daughter. My heart fluttered, but not joyfully, warpily. I answered. "Mom," she said quickly. "Sorry it's so late. It's been a crazy day." I remained silent. She continued talking, listing her chores, her problems, her fatigue. Then suddenly she fell silent. "You remember what day it is today, right?" she asked cautiously. I closed my eyes. "I remember," I said. She hesitated. "We decided it would be better to reschedule. We'll get together later. When we have time." The words were simple, almost caring, but there was something else between them. Not an accident, not forgetfulness, a decision. I suddenly saw it clearly, the way you see a pattern when you take a step back. "I see," I said. "You're not offended?" she asked quickly. I thought about it, and only that evening, at that very moment, did I understand. It wasn't about being offended. The point was that I had been gently, without anger, pushed aside, like an old book that people know by heart and never reread.
No, he answered quietly.
"I'm not offended." The conversation ended quickly. I put the phone down and sat for a long time, motionless. The room was quiet, not cozy, honestly. I looked at my hands and suddenly felt clarity, pure, almost cold. It wasn't an accident. They hadn't forgotten. They simply decided it was okay, that I would understand, that I would wait, that I wouldn't go anywhere. I stood up and went to the window. Evening had finally arrived. Lights were burning in the windows across the street, and beyond them were other people's celebrations, other people's conversations. I stood and thought about how many times in my life I'd been later, and how many times I'd agreed to it. I didn't cry that evening. The tears didn't come. Instead, I felt as if something inside me was slowly, ever so slowly, but finally changing. I didn't yet know how. I didn't know where it would lead. But I already understood. After this evening, I could no longer pretend nothing was happening. The celebration was over, but the understanding remained. The morning after a holiday is always special. It comes without expectations, without inner tension, without that childish hope that, strangely enough, lives within a person until the very end. I woke up later than usual. The house was filled with a gray light, calm, indifferent. This is the kind of light that lives on days in which surprises no longer await. I lay and listened to the ticking of the clock. Before, this sound irritated me, seemed too loud. Now it was almost comforting. Time passed. Slowly. Without asking permission. I thought. So life goes on even without congratulations. In the kitchen, everything looked the same as yesterday. The same cup, the same table, the same crack in the wall. Only something inside was different. Not more painful, but clearer. I made some tea and suddenly realized I didn't want anything sweet. It was as if yesterday had evaporated the need to comfort myself. The phone was on the table. I didn't check it right away. That, too, was new. Usually, the first thing I did was check to see if they'd written it down, if they'd remembered. Today, I didn't care. Or maybe I just hadn't yet dared to admit to myself that I didn't care. I sat by the window. Children were playing in the yard. Their laughter was loud and lively. I looked at them and thought about my grandchildren. How they probably didn't even know that yesterday was my birthday. They weren't told. Or maybe they were told, but only in passing in between other things. Children aren't to blame. I've always known that. Adults are. But the word to blame didn't fit. It was too harsh. More like they decided it was easier that way. I remembered how I once made decisions for my parents. How I thought, they'll understand. It's not that important to them. They've already had everything. Then it seemed logical. Now it's bitter. That afternoon, I went to the store. Not because I had to, but to get out of the house. It was cool outside. I walked slowly, feeling every thought fall into place. At the store, the saleswoman smiled at me and suddenly said, "Happy birthday to you, even though it was yesterday." I looked at her in surprise. "How do you know?" I asked. "You buy a cake every year on this day," she answered simply. I laughed. Quietly. A little awkwardly. "I didn't buy one this year," I said. She nodded without asking. Sometimes strangers understand more than loved ones. Sometimes life brings small surprises. Link in the description. At home, I put the kettle on and suddenly felt a strange urge to remove the photograph of me with the cake and candles from the wall. Not because it hurt, simply because it no longer reflected me. I removed the frame, wiped the glass, and put the photograph in a drawer. The wall felt empty, but this emptiness wasn't frightening. It was honest. In the afternoon, my son called. His voice was cautious, as if he were treading thin ice. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked. I paused. How am I? Before, I would have said fine. Now I've decided to tell the truth. "I'm thinking," I replied. He paused. "About what?" "About how easy it is to become invisible," I said calmly. He sighed. I'd heard that sigh for years. It always conveyed a desire to avoid conversation. "We didn't mean to offend you," he said. "I know," I replied. "But sometimes that's not enough." After we talked, I felt better. Not because he understood, but because I'd spoken. The words no longer stuck inside me. That evening, I lit a small lamp and sat down with a book. I couldn't read. My thoughts wandered beyond the pages. I thought about how quietly a person agrees to be in the background. How convenient it seems at first, not to disturb, not to demand, not to remind. And then suddenly you realize they've stopped seeing you. I wasn't angry. Anger requires strength. But I had a different feeling, determination. Quiet, without loud words. I suddenly understood clearly. If I pretended now that nothing had happened, it would only get quieter. People would remember me less and less. Not out of cruelty, out of habit. Before bed, I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was old, tired, but there was something new in my eyes. Not resentment, awareness. I lay down and couldn't fall asleep for a long time, but there was no anxiety in this insomnia. It was like anticipation, not of a holiday, of something else, something that didn't yet have a name. I didn't yet know what I would say or do, but I knew for sure I would no longer agree to be later. The third day after the holiday was surprisingly clear. Not in the weather. The sky was gray and low, but inside. I woke up without the heaviness in my chest, without the usual morning question, will they write today? Will they fix yesterday? That question was gone. Along with it, the expectation of apologies, explanations, and belated bouquets. I suddenly realized I no longer wanted compensation. Compensation is always late and never heals. I got up slowly, carefully, as if afraid to frighten this new state. It was fragile, but real. I made tea and, for the first time in many years, drank it without looking at my phone, without even turning my head in its direction. Before, it was like a window. I always wanted to check if anyone was looking in. Now that window could be closed. I remembered how many years ago I taught my daughter not to expect too much from people. I said, "Don't be offended if they don't live up to your expectations." At the time, I thought I was giving her wise advice. Now I realize that with that advice, I taught her not to pay too much attention to my expectations. We teach children not with words, but by how we allow ourselves to be treated. After breakfast, I decided to sort through the mailbox. Old postcards, notes, greetings. I had once treasured them as proof that I was needed. Now they seemed like traces of another life. I read the short signatures, recalled the voices, the intonations. Many of these people had long since disappeared, some from life, some from memory. I carefully folded the postcards back. I didn't throw them away. The past shouldn't be destroyed, it should be let go. By lunchtime, I felt tired and lay down to rest. Sleep came quickly. I dreamed of a house full of people, but no one saw me. I walked among them, heard conversations, laughter, but I was like a shadow. I woke up calmly. The dream didn't frighten me. It confirmed what I already knew. A friend called me that afternoon. We rarely spoke, but this time her voice was especially attentive. She said I'd changed, that it was even noticeable in my tone. I replied that I'd simply stopped pretending. We talked for a long time unhurriedly. I told her about the holiday, about the evening, about the understanding that had come late, but finally. She listened without interrupting, and only at the end said something that settled precisely and calmly on my heart. The worst thing is not being offended, but simply ignored. These words lingered in my mind long after the conversation. I wasn't hurt intentionally. I wasn't forgotten by accident. I was simply no longer considered an important part of the picture. I thanked her. Sometimes, just having someone put the right words to your feelings makes them feel less heavy. Sometimes life brings small surprises. Link in the description. That evening, I went outside again. I walked slowly, leaning on my cane. I used to be embarrassed by it. It seemed to make me feel helpless, to emphasize my age. Now I saw it as a support, honest, reliable, requiring no justification. People passed by, some made way, some looked right through me. And it no longer hurt. I no longer sought confirmation of my existence in their gazes. Near the entrance, I stopped and looked at the windows. A light was on in one, behind which someone was preparing dinner. In another, a television flooded the room with a bluish light. Other people's lives went on as usual, and mine too. I suddenly felt a strange calm at this thought. The world didn't have to revolve around me, but I no longer had to dissolve into it. When I returned home, my phone blinked with a notification. A message from my daughter. Short, cautious. "We'll come over this weekend if you want." Before, this "if you want" would have sounded formal, like politeness. Now I heard uncertainty in it. She no longer trusted me as a constant, as something taken for granted. I didn't answer right away. I sat down at the table, folded my hands, and thought, do I want to? Not because I have to, not because it's customary, but truly. The answer didn't come right away, but it was honest and calm. I wrote, "Come over, but not for long." After sending the message, I felt something click inside. A boundary. Simple, clear, without accusations or requests. I didn't close the door, I simply reserved the right to close it. That evening, I sat in the chair for a long time, covered with a blanket. The lights outside slowly faded. I thought about how often people are forgotten not because of a lack of love, but because of an overconfident expectation that they will always be there, always understand, always wait. And sometimes, just stopping waiting is enough to be noticed again. I didn't know how the story would end, but I knew I would no longer remain silent where it hurts. Even if my voice is quiet, even if it isn't heard right away. I prepared for the weekend without fuss. That was the first thing I noticed, and it surprised me. Previously, such visits would leave me in an internal rush. What to cook, what to buy, how to get everything done, how not to get tired before they walked in the door. Now I moved slowly, almost lazily, as if allowing myself the luxury of taking my time. I did only what I wanted, nothing unnecessary. I wiped the table, made some compote, put a simple pie in the fridge. Not festive, nothing special, just warm, homey. I didn't take out the best dishes or check 10 times that the towels were clean. The house was the same as I lived in it every day. And that's exactly what I wanted them to see. When the doorbell rang, I didn't flinch. I approached calmly, without my usual nervousness. My daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren stood at the threshold. The children immediately rushed to me and hugged me. Their hugs were sincere, loud, and alive. I hugged them back and suddenly realized I didn't feel tired. Just warmth. We sat down at the table. The conversation was cautious at first, as if everyone was testing whether it was okay to speak freely. I watched my daughter. She began looking at me more often, catching my gaze. Before, she was sure I was always there, always able to hold out. Now that confidence was gone, and in its place came attentiveness. At some point, she said, "Mom, we really didn't think about it then. Everything just got so complicated." I didn't argue. I didn't try to prove it. I simply looked at her and replied, "I know, but it was important for me to feel it." She nodded, and that was enough. Sometimes recognition is more important than explanations. The children ran around, ate pie, and got tired. I noticed how quickly I was starting to tire myself. And instead of remaining silent, I said, "I'll rest a little." I went into my room, lay down on the bed, and closed my eyes. Before, I would have endured until the very last moment, afraid of appearing weak or uncomfortable. Now I allowed myself a pause, and the world didn't collapse. When I returned, they were already getting ready. They weren't rushing, but they weren't dragging it out either. The farewell was calm, without guilt, without tension. I stood by the door and suddenly realized this is how it should be. Short visits, clear boundaries, a true presence. After they left, the house became quiet again. But this silence was no longer empty. There was no loneliness in it. There was a sense of completion, like after a conversation that was long overdue. That evening, my son called me. His voice was even, without its usual detachment. "Mom," he said, "you've become different." "I just started hearing myself," I replied. He paused and then said, "That's right." I hung up and sat for a long time, looking out the window. I thought about how little it takes to change your life. Sometimes you don't need big decisions. One day, One holiday that passed you by is enough to finally see the truth. I no longer felt forgotten. I felt seen. Maybe not right away. Maybe not completely. But enough. I knew there would be more moments ahead when I would feel pain. Old age doesn't make a person insensitive. But now I had a stronghold within. I was no longer a backdrop in someone else's life. Before bed, I went to the mirror. I looked at my reflection. My face was old, but there was no loss in it. There was calm and quiet strength. I went to bed feeling like the circle was closing, not because it was all over, but because I had finally found my place. After that conversation, life didn't suddenly become easier or brighter. It simply became mine. This feeling came gradually, without any sudden revelations, like morning. Not all at once, but a thin streak of light beneath the door. I woke up and knew. Today didn't require proof from me. No love, no need, no patience. I still lived in the same house, with the same windows and the familiar creaking of the floor. But now the house seemed to look at me differently. Or maybe I had learned to look at it differently. I stopped rushing, even in my thoughts. If I didn't want something, I let it not happen. If I wanted silence, I didn't fill it with other people's voices. The children began calling less often, but more attentively. A new quality appeared in their voices, caution. Not fear, but respect. They no longer spoke to me on the run. Sometimes the conversations were short, sometimes unexpectedly warm.
I didn't cling to them.
I accepted exactly as much as was offered and didn't ask for more. The grandchildren came. Not often, but each time it was real. I didn't take on more than I could handle. If I was tired, I talked. If I wanted silence, I went into my room. And they accepted it easily, without offense. Children generally understand boundaries better than adults. We teach them to erase them, and then we're surprised. Sometimes I thought about that holiday. It didn't hurt anymore. It became a point, not a wound, but a mark. A place where I finally stopped and looked at my life honestly. If they had come then, if there had been cake, flowers, fuss, perhaps I would have continued on, agreeing to be later. I didn't hold a grudge against them. Everyone does what they can. And I finally learned to be mindful of myself. I started going out alone more often, just sitting on a bench, listening to the city,
Looking at people.
Sometimes I caught glances, some sympathetic, some indifferent, and none of them defined me anymore. I stopped measuring myself by others' attention. We talked differently with my friends,
Deeper.
more honestly, without trying to appear cheerful. We talked about the fear of disappearing, about how painful it is to become invisible, and about how unexpectedly calm it is when you stop fighting for others' attention. These conversations didn't make us younger, but they made us more real. Sometimes in the evenings, I lit a small lamp and sat down with a book, reading it slowly, a few pages at a time. Not for the plot, but for the feeling. I was learning to be here, in this body, at this age, in this silence. I no longer waited for special dates. Holidays were no longer a test of love. If they remembered me, I rejoiced. If they didn't, I didn't crumble. That was the biggest change. Not in the relationship, but in me. One day, my daughter said, "Mom, you've become somehow whole." I smiled. That was the right word. I was no longer disintegrating into expectations and disappointments. I was gathering myself together, day by day, without rushing. I don't know how much time I have left, but now it doesn't worry me, because every day no matter how quiet, empty, or ordinary, belongs to me. And in this time, there's room for love, solitude, and peace. And that holiday, it wasn't the end, it was the beginning.